projects with climate, biodiversity, and desertification core benefits. So this event will enrich the ongoing debate on biodiversity, climate, and finance, as well as desertification, and will also be useful for the design of our future programs with core benefits for these international agreements. Thank you very much, and all welcome to this event on finance. Back to you, Odile.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth, for your welcome and also to set the scene for this event. But I think that what we have to understand now is what are the needs and transitions required to meet climate, biodiversity, and desertification targets. And now, can this be reached by aligning, as I said, public and private financial flows with these targets? And concretely, what does it mean, aligning flows? Because we speak a lot of that, we hear a lot of that, but we see that it's sometimes not so clear. So it has to be explained. And how can financial institutions achieve it, not only for climate, because it's in the Paris Agreement, but also for biodiversity and desertification? So to answer these questions and to introduce the discussion, I'm now pleased to invite Mrs. Sonja Tiluk-Singh, advisor of the CEO of the Global Environmental Facility. And I thank you a lot to champion at the last moment to speak with all of us. Sonja, can you clarify this? And also, can you share with us the GEF experience? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My apologies on behalf of Carlos Manuel, so I will step in on his behalf and hopefully do him justice. So with respect to the Global Environment Facility, I mean, of course, we are the financial mechanism for the three conventions, and we've played a huge role in that respect in these three respective thematic areas for the last 30 years. And it's our 30-year anniversary, as you'll see everywhere. And over this time, we've had our portfolio of programming and our programming strategies have increasingly reflected the global conversations around us and the global needs. So there are 2 points that I want to bring to your attention. One is that over this time, we've had increasing movements towards integration across the focal areas. I mean, as I heard Elizabeth speak, I thought, she actually took my talking points because integration is so key. And this has been reflected in the GEF portfolio over these years through an increasing move in multifocal area projects, so projects that bring together the three focal areas of biodiversity, climate change, and land degradation, as well as the other 2 focal areas that we cover, which is international waters and chemicals and wastes. And in GEF 6, which was, began in 2014, in that 4-year cycle, we introduced, some flagship programs called the Integrated Approach Pilots, which really sought to bring integration to the forefront of how we do business. And together with that, we have increasing amounts of flexibility in terms of how countries program resources. So we have an allocation system in the GEF, and countries receive an allocation in each one of these 3 areas: biodiversity, climate change, and land degradation in every cycle. And over time, what we've seen is that countries more and more want to pool those resources together to address different objectives in multiple ways, rather than having individual thematic projects. So, in GEF 5, we had, I think, 12% of our resources were flexible, where countries could pool those resources together for up to a certain amount. And over time, over the successive cycles, up till the present moment, we've seen increasing amounts of percentages being subjected to flexibility. So these 2 things go hand in hand, and integration together with full flexibility has been an increasing feature of the GEF business. And in this moment, we're actually in a very important moment in GEF history, in the sense that we're on the verge of our GEF 8 replenishment. So we're in current negotiations for that. And we are deepening the approach of integration in those proposed strategies. And we are also suggesting full flexibility. So instead of 12%, 20%, 30%, we're now suggesting to our authorizing environment that our countries have full flexibility in terms of how they use their resources in these 3 focal areas. And those 2 approaches go hand in hand. So this responds, I think, this responds to the urgent needs that are upon us. You know, we have, I think we all agree, we have 10 years to really turn the tide of you know, the direction in which things are going. And you know, the conventions, the countries, the political environments, all of these are reflecting that ambition. And so the Global Environment Facility is attempting to reflect that ambition as well through how we are planning and negotiating for GEF 8. We're also aiming for a higher replenishment precisely to meet the levels of ambition coming from countries and coming from the conventions. Now, this brings me to another point, which is, you know, that of the nature funding gap. You know, this, you know, we can define this in a number of ways, and the ways in which I would define it would be the gap between what is currently being spent on environmental conservation and what is needed in order to turn this tide in the next 10 years. And the gap is huge. The gap has been estimated in different numbers by a variety of institutions and reports. You know, there's different thematic areas have also estimated their own financial needs. So there's no one number yet we can point at, but I think there is a consensus on three things. One, that the nature funding gap exists, which means that what we are giving towards nature conservation and what we actually need to give towards nature conservation, there's a difference. It exists, it is large, and it needs to be narrowed. And the question that those questions are what we need to answer. So ODA funds, which is how the GEF funds are traditionally defined, ODA funds are usually relied upon to close that funding gap. But another well-established fact in current global conversations is that ODA funds alone can't do it. So we need to mobilize funds from a variety of partners, public and private. And the GEF, you know, has an increasing number of policies and programs and strategies in this regard. Now, these additional funding sources includes national governments, the private sector, of course, NGOs, philanthropy. And we also need to be more strategic in how we use the limited funds that we have. So we need to increasingly seek innovative mechanisms of financing and of funding and of programming. And we also need to not only increase the funds going into the gap, but we also need to reduce the need for those funds. And we need to increase the impact of the funds that we have. And one of the ways in which to do this is through policy coherence, which is very much a part of the conversation, you know, international conversations at the present moment. So policy coherence, you know, I will use the analogy, if we have policy incoherence at the national level, what this means is that a lot of the investments that we put into countries through a variety of mechanisms, including the GEF, will not have the impact that we think. So ODA funds from the developed world into developing countries, unless there's a particular environment, an environment of policy alignment within countries, the impact of those funds will be less and less. And I think this is a much not yet, I don't want to say ignored, but it's not yet highlighted in a lot of the work that we do and in the work that other institutions do. So policy coherence, I'll just give you one definition. There are many. Policy coherence is traditionally defined as the systematic promotion of mutually reinforcing policy actions across government departments and agencies, creating synergies towards achieving the agreed objectives. You know, I'll say it's an analogy that I like to use is that putting funds into countries where there's policy incoherence at the national level is like putting ODA funds into, putting water into a bucket with a hole. So if you try to fill a bucket and there's a hole in the bucket, then the water keeps seeping out. And policy coherence at its most extreme level can be seen, policy incoherence at its most extreme level can be seen as that way. It can be seen as where we're channeling funds into countries, but the environment within the countries is not allowing those funds to have the strongest positive impact that it could do. And in the present moment where funds to the environment are limited, I think that those limited funds need to be able to be maximized in terms of their benefits. Now, policy coherence is not new to the GEF. In fact, our founding documents actually speak explicitly about the need to transform policy environments and the need to impact policy in order to have sustainable impact beyond the life of GEF projects. And policy coherence is also something that's appearing in a lot of global dialogues in the last couple of years. There's, albeit by many different names. So one of the names that we see is the whole of government approach. We have, the OECD, the SDGs, the Paulson report on financing nature, the declaration by the G7 nations, various other studies. There are so many that I can't list them. But all of them, when I read them, I see policy coherence as an underlying thread in terms of having an impact, having the needed impact towards the 2030 and 2050, and the variety of international goals and targets that are popping up as we go. Now, policy coherence is, as a result, in recognition of these conversations and as a response to these international conversations and international need and international ambition, the GEF 8 strategy, which is currently under negotiation, reflects to a large extent in a number of entry points the notion of domestic policy coherence. And my last point is that, the work that we do at the Global Environment Facility, in terms of closing the nature funding gap, one way to look at it is that we act as a multiplier. So our funds are ODA, but that doesn't mean we only have an ODA impact in closing the gap, because simultaneously by the work that we do in terms of coordinating across multiple stakeholders at the national level, in terms of co-financing that we bring from multiple sources, in terms of our private sector partnerships and an increasing trend towards actively engaging with the private sector in a number of different ways, towards how we deal with national entities, our operational focal points, bringing all the stakeholders together around one conversation, which doesn't often happen in developing countries. Through a number of ways, we magnify impact by the limited ODA funds that are available into environmental conservation and into closing the financing gap. So those are the points I wanted to share with you today. I'm very happy to continue the conversation at any point, and it was my pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sonja, for explaining us what the GEF is doing and for explaining us this concept. And if I try to summarize what you say regarding the fact to align flows and so on, I see two or three main points. As you said, mobilizing funds coming from all sources, either public or private finance, but also government, corporates, and so on, to fill the gap. And that means also developing innovative mechanism, financial mechanism, but also new market products. And I think that we will have interesting examples today with our panelists. And the second point is to reduce the needs. And reducing the needs, that means also looking at the risk for the financial sector, the nature-related or climate-related risk. We don't speak of desertification-related risk, but I think we could. And that's a lot of work now being done on this issue too. And you also develop the fact that for that, that's not only the financial sector that has to work, but also the governments in lines with them. And you spoke a lot of policy coherence, and I think it's part of the needs and expectation also from the financial sector. So thanks a lot, and without forgetting that all this finance needs to develop impact. That's the aim of all of us. So thanks a lot for your introduction. What I propose you to discuss now is what is already done, as I said in the introduction, or what could be done concretely in a different organization, and above all in the organization of our panelists, and on the ground to align this flow with our objectives, with our three objectives. So our panelists will explain to you, to the audience, strategies in place among the main financial operators to meet these demands, and will illustrate that with concrete example on the ground. So we have today and thank you, Sonja. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And you can stay as young as you want. We have today a very interesting and diverse panel. Please, ladies, come to exchange on this topic. And it's my pleasure to introduce our 5 panelists. One is online. And as you can see, is that okay? Oh, you want to sit here? Okay, yeah. As you can see, it's also my pleasure to introduce a female panel. We have only women today, and it's really rare, and I'm so happy with that. Yes. So ladies, Mrs. Jessica Bedoya is the Chief of Staff and Chief Strategy Officer at the InterAmerican Development Bank. Mrs. Mathilde Borlaurence is the Head of Climate at the French Agency of Development Bank. Mrs. Carolina Fuentes is the Secretary of the Board and Head of the Governance Office of the Green Climate Fund, one of our hosts, and you are responsible for the provision of support across the governance structure. Mrs. Karen Sack is Executive Director of the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance and CEO of Ocean Unit. And we have online Sonia Lichtman. I don't know if we can see her. She is responsible of engagement and stewardship at Federated Hermes International, which is an asset manager in UK. And Sonia is also co-chair of the policy working group of the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge and Foundation. That's a group of 78 private financial institutions committed to act for biodiversity. So I don't know if we can see Sonia. Not yet, but she will come. So my first question to all of our panelists is, as a public development bank or an investor or an NGO, what is your current view and strategy on aligning these flows for the biodiversity, climate, and desertification? And finally, how do you combine a net zero with a nature positive vision? So Mathilde, first. Can you tell us about your biodiversity and climate strategies?
Am I really starting? Thank you, Odile.
I finished my question. Within the French Development Agency Group, you have now several strategies. Will you have one at the end? How will you ensure their coherence? What about the allocation of 30% of climate fund to biodiversity? You will explain that to us. And you will explain also how this concept is spreading across the development bank's community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Odile, and thank you indeed for inviting us in this panel. I'm very honored to participate in this feminine panel even more. To answer your question, I think I need to get back first on ADB Journey on climate before reaching to our biodiversity agenda. You may know how important, or the audience may not, so I will explain how important the climate agenda has been for our organizations for decades now. We have been one of the first development finance institutions to have a climate strategy back in 2005. And we have a very strong focus as in our operations. More than 50% of our funding must bear a climate co-benefit. So it's a very huge commitment. In 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, of course, it became quite obvious that we also needed to answer pretty fast what we were doing with the other 50% and not bearing a climate co-benefit. And therefore, the Paris alignment commitment, and you talked about alignment earlier in the session, came up very rapidly, and AFD took this commitment quite early in 2017. And I think we are a number within AFD to regret that at the time we were not ready to take a similar commitment on biodiversity. And we must face it, the subject was not mature enough within our portfolio, within our knowledge, within our thinking. Since then, of course, we have been working hard with 3 work streams that I will highlight because they are structuring today our latest development in terms of biodiversity finance. We have just approved, it's new, it's one of the announcements of the COP. We have just approved a renewed approach on our selectivity and exclusion criteria that will guarantee the no net loss standard for nature in all our investments. That's first. Second, so this is the do no harm commitment, if I summarize. Second, we will and we are working to publish by the end of the year a set of principles for tracking our nature positive finance. So of course that will allow us not only to track the financial flows towards biodiversity and nature, but this should also be a powerful tool later on to analyze the alignment question when the global framework for biodiversity will emerge from COP15. these are two very big steps. It took a few years to come to this point because we are resolutely advancing on a nature positive future. Of course, we are doing that because we are really convinced of the interdependency that was already discussed by previous panelists, convinced that we can't work on the climate crisis without taking into account biodiversity and environmental crisis. This was said earlier. And this brought us to our third decision, which is that we need to make sure to finance biodiversity. We need to make sure that the two agenda, climate and biodiversity, are not competing within our own teams, that we need to build a common pipeline of projects, simply. And this is how AFD came up with the commitment to deliver 30% of its climate finance with nature co-benefits, biodiversity co-benefits. 30%, and we are on track to reach this level by 2025, meaning 1 billion of finance for biodiversity delivered by AFD at this point in time. I can only call, and I'll stop there, Odile, I know you have a number of other panelists, I can only call other banks to join us. We are discussing with a number of stakeholders. We are using our partnership with the International Development Finance Club and the Finance in Common Summit to raise traction on this topic, and it's getting some interest.
Thank you, Mathilde. That's a great commitment done by AFD now, and hopefully several banks will join you. So, Carolina, the Green Climate Fund has been dedicated to climate finance since its creation. However, there has been a shift towards biodiversity issues for some time. What are your orientation and strategies in this area?
Perfect. Many thanks for that question, and I'm very honored also to join in this panel with the very distinguished friends here to speak on this very important topic. Now, with regards to the GCF and also the contribution that is being made in terms of global investments, also to address matters not only pertaining to climate change, but to biodiversity, ecosystems, and desertification. It is also very important to know that since the establishment of the GCF in 2010, the institution has grown to become today the largest climate finance institution globally. That is also revealed by the fact that less than a month back, the size of the portfolio of the GCF reached $10 billion. That is a landmark figure in terms of climate finance worldwide. We're very proud of that, but of course we're even more proud of the fact that this is supporting climate action in developing countries in a very concrete manner. Also, importantly, is the fact that a meaningful part of these investments, the GCF investments, go also to ecosystem and to nature-based management approaches. This is due to the fact that 3 of our result areas are closely linked to forest and land use, to agriculture, to ecosystem and ecosystem services. And it is because of this that we have already invested a significant amount of the 10 billion that the GCF has approved at the moment in terms of funding proposals in these very important areas. Now, let me speak to you about some of the numbers. When it comes to ecosystem and ecosystem services, at present, 1.4 billion have been invested in GCF resources. This is 14% of our current portfolio. That is very significant. Now, when it comes to forest and land use, approximately 570 million have been approved in funding proposals, which is 7% of our portfolio. That is already a significant amount of resources that has been invested in this area. Just recently also in our last meeting of the board, B30, 30% of the resources, the total amount of resources approved, went to ecosystem and ecosystem services, including forest. This is also very revealing in terms to the extent to which the GCF is today contributing as well to the joint costs of supporting countries in achieving sustainable development. And this is also targeting the targets of the 3 conventions. Now, in terms of looking forward, well, we in the GCF have been developing sectoral strategies. The sectoral strategy in ecosystem and ecosystem services is to be ready before the year ends after thorough consultations. And on this strategy, we have also realized that there is a need to move toward large-scale restoration. And of course, this needs to incorporate the actions of all relevant communities. Also, some other areas to further work on are bioagriculture and sustainable management in coastal and marine ecosystems. So we still hope to do more, and of course that needs to be aligned to the priorities of countries as submitting in funding proposals to the GCF. So an invitation to the NDAs and to the accredited entities to please submit impactful funding proposals on these strategic areas.
Thanks a lot, Carolina. I think you explained very well that nature is and ecosystem services is one of the major solutions to the climate crisis, and I would say vice versa. And you open also the door to things we didn't say, but which are there, NBS, so nature-based solution, and what are the more critical sectors also to invest in, as forest, land use, agriculture, and some others, and infrastructure, I would add. And also with the restoration area, which is a huge way to invest, and in a way a huge market also, if I can say. So I speak from market, so I will come back. I will go to Sonia Lichtman. So Sonia is online. I hope we can see her from Federated Hermes International. And Sonia, how will you as an investor move from a net zero commitment, so a climate commitment, to a nature positive perspective? What is the vision of your company? Is this challenging transformation? And furthermore, can you perhaps elaborate also on the finance for biodiversity position in this area? Sonia, are you with us?
Thank you, Odile. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you, and sorry not to be there in person. I'll be arriving to Glasgow tomorrow and just missing you. But yes, it's a great question. And as investors, the main way that we're going to achieve both net zero and nature positive is through the actions of the companies that we're invested in. So of course, that's about investing in new solutions and innovative companies, but it's also about taking the companies in our current portfolio on the journey and engaging with them to make the necessary changes. Because what we're after is changes in the real economy. If we just divest from a company, that might mean that somebody else just comes and invests and there isn't a change to the emissions or to the biodiversity impacts. So we at Federated Hermes International place a really big emphasis on stewardship and engagement, which is really the way we influence companies in our portfolios to make changes. So we've committed to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. So we're working on getting to net zero. And we're also, as you've mentioned, signatories to the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, which commits us to doing 5 things by 2024 at the latest, including collaborating with industry peers, setting biodiversity targets, measuring our own impact, and reporting on the progress annually. So we really need to see the issues of climate and biodiversity as interconnected. And we need to set very clear expectations to companies of where we expect them to get to, so that they know what we want from them in a way. And we can't see these issues as silos. Sometimes it's easy to come to a company with a list and say, we need you to do this, this, and this, but it becomes quite confusing to them. And also they might address one thing at the expense of something else, perhaps addressing climate change at the expense of biodiversity. So we really need to kind of have holistic solutions that address the challenges simultaneously. And I think on climate, we're at a place where we know what we expect from companies. We need companies in our portfolios to be aligned to net zero and to be aligned to a 1.5 degree trajectory. And that's what we're trying to test, and we're escalating engagements, sometimes recommending votes against directors at companies where we don't think there is alignment to the goals of the Paris Agreement. But on biodiversity, we're not exactly sure what we need to be aligned to. So what we really need is a global biodiversity framework that we can all work towards implementing, like we're doing for the Paris Agreement. And also, with time, we'll need sector-specific pathways and sort of guidelines for what nature positive will look like in mining, in agriculture, in all the different sectors, so that we can also push companies in that direction. But there's really exciting work happening in this area. You know, we've got science-based targets for nature in development, lots of other initiatives springing up, and it's been really positive to see biodiversity especially come up to be almost at the same level of climate change in terms of risk and opportunity. And in terms of the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, there are different work streams. So we're working on how to better engage with companies, how to define those expectations and understand which directions we should be pushing them in so that we can get to nature positive. We're also working on the policy advocacy work stream, and that's really about understanding the global biodiversity framework and how the financial sector can best be reflected in the framework and also then contribute to implementing the global biodiversity framework. So some exciting times ahead, definitely. Thanks, Odile.
Thanks a lot, Sonia. What is important here, I think, is to see the role of an investor with the clients and how they can support them, finance support, but also push them to go further in terms of climate. Sure, that's done more or less, but and this new issue of new for the investor of biodiversity. And what I also wanted to highlight is that Finance for Biodiversity pledge is now an observer at the CBD convention and the CBD work, which is new. That's the first financial union, if I can say, which is part of our process, and that's really, really good. And they're hoping a GBF with clear and understandable targets, so that will help them to apply. So now, Karen, you are coming from the NGO world, and I wanted to have you first for two reasons. First because you will speak of ocean, which is perhaps rare, and or more rare, I would say. And secondly, because you are working with financial institutions, and what we can see, and above all with the private ones, that the pioneers, very often, they are working with NGOs, helping them to better understand what is, I would say, more biodiversity, because climate is there, and perhaps the links between them. And it gives new mechanism, new financial products, and above all with you in the insurance world. So please, Karen, can you explain how you NGOs, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, work with companies and financial institutions in this area, and what are for you the main challenges to align these flows, as we always say, consistently with climate and biodiversity risks and resilience?
Well, thank you, Odile. It's lovely to be here with you, and nice to see the ocean on the platform. Biggest biosphere on our planet, holds more than 80% of all life on Earth, and absorbs 45% of the carbon that we've released in terms of CO2 emissions. So it's a big forgotten piece of our planet. And several years ago, working in collaboration with AXA, Ocean Unite, which is the NGO that I lead, convened an Ocean Risk Summit in Bermuda, a site where insurers get together. And we brought together about 200 people representing finance, insurance, civil society, academia, and government to focus on some of these big issues of ocean risk, what a changing, heating, more polluted ocean with less biodiversity in it means in terms of things like food security, migration, biodiversity, and associated issues. And what we realized is that everyone was speaking a completely different language, which is when we set up the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance. So it's a unique alliance bringing together these different sectors. And really our focus is on how do we build that resilience to change by putting the best brains in the business around the table and seeing how we can work together. We know that having a single finance expert in a non-profit versus working with Deutsche Bank and the power that they can bring through their research and knowledge can make a significant difference. And actually, we just launched last week an initiative called Back Blue, which is a pledge we are seeking the finance and insurance community to sign, building on some of the climate finance pledges, but adding in a blue tinge, so how to invest in the ocean. The biggest challenges that we see are, I think, quite similar to other sectors, but perhaps more exacerbated because the ocean is this often forgotten space. And I would say there's 6 key points here. The first is just very simply, there's a lack of finance. The second is related to that, which is that there is a lack of ocean financial literacy, an understanding of what investment into ocean and coastal natural capital can actually mean in terms of resilience building. For many investors, there is also the problem of the project pipeline. So in our space, where from the NGO community, we get very excited for a $2 to $5 billion investment. The financial community is not interested until we're looking at a $500 million deal flow. And so how do we mesh those two different things together? I think the third thing is what I call stasis. There is, amongst the public sector, we constantly get told, you need to bring in the private sector in order for us to invest. And from the private sector, we then hear, well, we need to see the public sector invest first, or philanthropy. And so somehow we've got to break that down, and we've got to show that there is an investment opportunity for all of those sectors, and that those investment opportunities, particularly into nature-based solutions, are both cost-effective and biodiversity positive in terms of their results, and have a climate positive outcome. So, I think all of that value proposition is really important. And then I would just add that policy coherence piece and alignment across these different sectors.
Thanks a lot, Karen. What you mentioned about this difference of language is so important. We've seen that also between the CBD community and the financial sector and the private one above all, and we try to make this person speak together and understand together, because they are very, very different languages, and sometimes that's a problem. And what you also mentioned between the link between public and private finance, that's also really important with this blended finance you didn't mention, but that's a fact. And in order to to reinsure, I would say, also the private sector to de-risk and have some return. So now we are coming back to the public finance with you, Jessica, from the InterAmerican Development Bank. You have been very proactive in biodiversity finance these last years. You have integrated biodiversity and climate change topic within the bank. Can you tell us a bit more about your strategy at the ADB?
Of course, thank you. And thank you to all of my fellow panelists. I know that we at the InterAmerican Development Bank have partnered with almost all of you, if not all of you, so I appreciate that spirit of sponsorship and partnership, and we hope to continue working together in the future. I want to say that I want to start for us at the InterAmerican Development Bank that we're starting from a very different basis, and I give a lot of credit to our keynote speaker who mentioned the concept of integration, because I think for far too long in the development bank sphere, we've addressed these problems, as it was correctly stated before, in a very siloed way. And that does create an environment where it's very difficult for us to ultimately measure results, whether in terms of financing coming in, investment going into the countries, or at the end of the day, if we're having a positive impact. So what we've done in the last year as a new administration at the Inter-American Development Bank is we've finally said, no, climate, you can't impact in a positive way climate change if you don't address decarbonization, biodiversity, sustainable land use. All of that is climate change, is addressing the challenges that all of the countries, at least that we deal with our 26 member countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, that we're trying to face. So step one was we started from an integrated approach to develop a new policy. And I'm very proud that as a cornerstone of the Vision 2025, which our president has outlined as our agenda for the next 5 years, climate change in this integrated way is well designed. And the architecture for what has now become our climate action plan, that we're one of the first MDBs to set forth many more aggressive targets in terms of climate finance and other activities that we're doing in the region. So point one is we've started from the premise of integration. I think point two is that we've really faced a challenge in the region of trying to convince countries that financing, climate finance, investment in finance is investment in the future, is investment in jobs, is investment in sustainable development, because ultimately what we as a development bank seek out to do is affect and improve the lives of the poor and most vulnerable. And it just so happens that there's a cross-reference there between the poorest and most vulnerable in Latin America and the Caribbean and the impact and effects of climate change. So we needed to bridge that gap. And so what we've been trying to do, and we continue to do, I think successfully, because we do have some case studies which we'll discuss later in terms of concrete projects and examples, where countries have finally understood that climate isn't just a non-integrated issue that you can invest in if you have enough left on your balance sheet at the end of the day once you've paid all your bills from your national budget, but in fact has to be an integrated part. And part of that is the conversation of bringing in ministers of economy and finance with climate and environment ministers, so that there is a conversation that addresses the policy coherence or lack of coherence that you tend to see. And I would say that the third issue here is for us as a finance institution, we do provide public finance, but also trying to find innovative mechanisms. You mentioned the blended finance structure, but we're looking at other ways so that we can also better measure the impact, because I think another challenge that we've confronted in addressing each of these cones of climate, if per se, is that we can't really measure progress holistically. And I think as more and more countries are more interested in climate finance structures, are more interested in understanding what do they get out of the investment in climate, besides us telling them you'll get a net 15 million new jobs with decarbonization, is providing them the clear roadmap of what you will see on the ground. That sustainable land use will lead to not only conservation of tropical forests, Latin America and the Caribbean is home to 50% of tropical forests, but also means you can, and pertaining to traditional customs, you can have jobs, you can create markets, you can create avenues for economic development and growth. So I think all of these components together are really what's been framing what we at the IDB have been trying to do on all of these issues combined. And also, because for Latin America and the Caribbean, conservation is critical, we were linking that directly to the sustainability aspect. And I will just end on one last point, that we do have other mechanisms institutionally, such as the Natural Capital Lab, which has helped bring in financing and resources from the UK as well as from France, and we're very grateful for that, which has helped also mainstream the idea of biodiversity along with all of the additional climate activities that we've executed. So all of that to say that I think the ground is ripe, and us at COP26 present today demonstrates our commitment to these efforts, and we hope that other MDBs follow suit, and we have no fear in being leaders among the MDBs in terms of the regional development banks at least, so that they can see that we're willing to take aggressive action and to finally put all of the pieces together so that our countries can benefit from it.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. And it's important to highlight the important role of the MDBs and with the government, with also all the other financing sector. And something you said, which is also important, is the link of this climate and biodiversity with the development questions and with the social issues also, because protecting biodiversity or climate is not being cannot be done without looking at people and with this creating jobs and so on. That's so important. So thanks a lot. Now we go to, we speak a lot of aligning flow. Okay. Everyone wants to align flow, but concretely on the ground, what does it mean? So I would like you to illustrate this concept with some projects that you are developing in your different companies or supporting in other companies in the different sectors. What are these projects? What innovation, if any, have been developed, either in a technical, financial, or cooperation way, or different research work also, as you mentioned, Jessica, and so on. So I will ask you all to develop a project. I will also ask you, because I'm conscious of the time, to be perhaps a bit more brief than it has been for the first question. So, Carolina, could you illustrate what you've said before with an adaptation project, perhaps at the GCF? I give you 3 minutes, no more.
I'll be very happy to illustrate how the GCF works in supporting ecosystem projects and projects on biodiversity as well, with a very specific example that was just approved recently in the last meeting of the board that took place last month. This is the Amazon Bioeconomy Fund. This is a project that addresses the request to support a region. This is a region of 6 Amazonian countries. And the project is for 275 million that is provided in different financial instruments. That is also one of the key features of GCF, that we can have these different financial structures with different instruments. Primarily, we are supporting this project with grants, followed by loans, and also there is a small piece of equity. That is very important for us because that way the project can be more flexible, and also there is a strengthened manner in which we can address the risk of the project. This project is an interesting one for us in the GCF because it relates to an innovative approach to catalyze a private investment through bio businesses. What this is businesses that use the sustainable capital of forest in a manner that is respectful with the environment, but that uses at the end of the day the capital and the assets of nature, so we can provide the business case for these value chains. Just as an example, some of the value chains that are part of this project are sustainable agroforestry, also the development of non-timber products, and the support of a particular cultivation, like the cultivation of native palm. These are critical and key agro businesses, and through this project, we are trying also for these businesses to be able to support them in an innovative way, in which they are being integrated as part of a value chain, but one that is respectful to the environment. And this is supporting, as mentioned, 6 Amazonian countries. It was just recently approved. And we have many more examples, but I'll keep them for another occasion.
I guess you have many more. Thank you. Thank you for this really interesting project, merging different financial mechanisms and on different topics and so on. Thanks a lot. So now I will go to Karen. Can you explain us the work that you are doing with AXA for the development of new insurance products in the private sector this time?
Yes, thank you. And so this is so important, as you mentioned. The building or reducing risk is really critical to drive investment into these spaces. And so the insurance work is really important. So the first quick thing to say is that later this week, AXA will actually be releasing a coastal risk index where they model forward to look at different climate scenarios and the potential impacts of those scenarios with habitat degradation and sea level rise in coastal areas, so that the financial sector as well as the public sector can begin to see what the potential risk is to their assets within those areas. So critical tools that are needed to understand those. So that's an example, but I think the critical example that I'd like to focus on is actually something we did with IDB, working with local groups in the Mesoamerican Reef region, the Mesoamerican Reef Fund. The IDB actually financed an economic valuation of the reef across the 4 countries, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and Mexico. And as a result of that valuation, Willis Towers Watson, the insurance brokers, were able to determine what it would cost to develop and deploy a parametric reef insurance policy. So based on the wind speed of hurricanes, they can pay out within 2 weeks an insurance policy which helps the tourism workers in those areas who are often out of work as a result of a hurricane get in the water and restore the reef, both prior to an event as well as straight afterwards. And it's often the debris on the reef afterwards that isn't cleaned up that destroys more of the reef. And those reefs are critical in reducing the impacts of storm surge. As a result of that, AXA has actually bought the policy. So this is the first policy that's gone to the market in less than a year of its development. So AXA Climate and AXA XL have participated in that. So we're really excited and looking to expand that around the world now.
Thanks a lot, Karen. That's amazing what is now being developed in the insurance sector. We were both at an event, a series of events on insurance last 2 weeks ago, and insurers are insuring marshes, wetlands, coral reefs, and so on, mangroves, and so on, and risk also between animals, elephants, and people. And I was so surprised and amazed. That's really, really, really interesting. So, Sonia, at Federated Hermes, how do you engage with companies in the portfolio to achieve nature and climate co-benefits? Can you explain us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I think perhaps the clearest example is engaging with companies in the food sector. So anything from agriculture to consumer goods and retail. Because we know that the food system as a whole contributes between 25 and 30% of global emissions, and is also probably the main driver of biodiversity loss when we take into account the full supply chain. So we're engaging with companies across that food supply chain on how to get to net zero across the full scope, so scopes 1, 2, and 3. And of course, most of that work will be done in agriculture. So transitioning and working with farmers to transition to more regenerative, sustainable and organic agricultural models that ensure that soil is much more of a carbon sink than a carbon source. Alongside that, we're looking very closely at deforestation and land use change. Of course, we can't have any companies in food getting to net zero whilst still contributing to deforestation. So we have clear expectations on deforestation for companies and how they can work on improving traceability, eliminating their contribution to deforestation. And of course, we know that will have both climate change and biodiversity benefits. And I also really echo previous points that we need to look at the social dimension. Indigenous communities especially have been looking at some of these issues for much longer than we have, and we need to include them as part of the solution and their perspective critically. So sustainable agriculture, deforestation, and then really critical, companies in the food sector need to change their product portfolios to sell different food. So we know that to feed a growing population, we'll need less meat, better meat. The fishing industry, which Karen, I'm sure, can talk for many hours about the many issues associated with current fishing practices. But really, we're speaking to companies about how to change some of those product portfolios in a way that can address both climate change and biodiversity issues.
Thanks a lot, Sonia. We see that we have a lot of examples in the agricultural side, but it's one of the main domain or sector with a lot of stress on biodiversity, but also on climate, and where huge and innovative development can also be done to achieve our targets. So, Jessica, what are some of the projects that you are particularly proud of in the biodiversity and climate space this year at IDB?
Sure. My answer will be short because I've been cribbed by my colleagues on the panel who mentioned 2 great collaborative efforts already with the IDB. I'm very proud to say that I've been cribbed by them because of these innovative projects that we're doing. The first is the Amazon Initiative. That is the hallmark of what we are doing at the InterAmerican Development Bank, and I'm very proud of the work that our amazing team has done to create a structure that promotes that integrated approach that I described earlier. In fact, every pillar of the Amazon Initiative touches on every pillar we're discussing here today in terms of biodiversity, sustainable land use, and climate. And we are partnering with the GCF, and we are very grateful that their board approved the project, so thank you for that. But we're very grateful for the funding because it's going to allow us to be very innovative in the way that we're approaching financing projects in the future and bringing in rural communities in particular, because that is an important component that we saw in working in the Amazon region in particular. If you don't have buy-in from local communities, it's hard to really engage and bring in the financing to bring in the projects that will have higher impact. So that's one. Second, I would say is recently we announced at the New York Stock Exchange the Natural Asset Capital, a part of Intrinsic Exchange, which basically allows us to now create natural asset companies. And we viewed this as a critical part of moving with the markets. We were recently traveling in New York and spoke with a lot of banks on Wall Street, and I was recently in Rome as well, participating in a forum to discuss climate change pre-COP, and spoke with members of the private sector there as well. And the common thread is that the private sector is trying to push the market fast so that the governments and the countries follow. So I'm really proud of these efforts because these create the space for us to work with the markets, especially to bring in and leverage and mobilize financing. So those are a couple of the examples, and like I said, we obviously have worked with Aura on the Mesoamerica initiative, which was quite successful.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. And yes, that's also a new topic to come to this sector, if I can say, which are perhaps not used to climate, sure, but to biodiversity, absolutely not, as a stock exchange and so on, and to develop this natural asset view also. That's something which can be seen on the biodiversity side as strange, and what is that? Nature as an asset, but it has been developed also by the Dasgupta team, and that's really interesting. And now I need my paper, but Mathilde is for you, but I know what to ask you. Can you develop us an IFD project with all these three type of objectives? And perhaps also, I wanted to ask you perhaps more, what has been the challenge also in a more concrete way to develop a project and to monitor it concretely on the ground?
I think what I will want to share with you is really the challenge of this 30% biodiversity convergence of, maybe we call it integration, because everybody's using the word integration more than convergence. What is important to understand is that behind that, the operational teams had to follow this pledge, which was an important pledge, and therefore to think differently about biodiversity funding. So this really took a little bit of time to really work on mainstreaming biodiversity activities in all our projects. It starts with screening all the projects at early stage to see and assess with all the teams if there is a potential for biodiversity components to enhance the outcome in terms of nature positive potential of this project. So this is huge work, really huge, and each and every project is screened this way. And therefore came up a number of new proposals. We moved from biodiversity funding, which was dedicated more to conservation of biodiversity, financing conservancies, financing the Kenya Wildlife Service. I know this project pretty well. I followed it a few years ago, for instance, to merging really climate and biodiversity projects, to working more with adaptation and biodiversity communities. So for instance, it means working in cities, on green cities, using the natural potential of these cities to work on inundation and flood management. It means also, of course, working on a number of aspects on nature-based solutions that were already referred about by previous panelists. So to give a few examples, for instance, we have the Kiwa initiative, which is in the Pacific islands, aiming to restore productive ecosystem, to also help natural protection such as mangrove in this part of the world. We also have in Africa the Great Green Wall initiative, which there is an ongoing panel on the subject in the Sahel region. We're working on agroecology, working on reforestation, notably. There is one last point I can't miss. It's not a project, but it's something which has very important impacts. It's not so shiny, but it will impact how a development finance institution will work as well in terms of biodiversity, which is risk management and assessment. And of course, another important work that we are working on is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. It's important to acknowledge this important work. It's similar than the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and these are very important prospects and things to implement for all of us.
thank you, Mathilde, to highlight what you are doing and also to introduce a new sector, cities. That's also really important and so interesting also to see how to introduce biodiversity in cities, and to mention the risk management and the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, that we know well at the CBD because our executive secretary is co-chair of this TNFD, and that's really interesting because in that way, it makes the links between the biodiversity world and the financial world, because the other co-chair is coming from the financial sector, the pure financial sector. So with that, I will give the floor to the audience. If you have some questions, please raise your hands. I will ask you to say who you are first, and to ask a brief question to one or many of our panelists. Thanks a lot. So who has a question to raise? Thank you to be the first.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Mqoli Sispanda, and I work with the Commonwealth Secretariat. And we do work with some of you, which is brilliant to see. One of the big things we're trying to push ahead now is this whole integration agenda with the Commonwealth countries, 54 of them. And I just wanted to ask the panelists, both on the land and on the oceans, is there a way that any of you are directing finance to particularly those places where we know high biodiversity and there is huge potential for making a mark in terms of climate mitigation adaptation? So much that, you know, all places are the same, but they're not exactly the same. But how do you intend to direct financing where it's needed the most, where it can make the most impact?
And I can take that one and perhaps just mention some of the aspects that are relevant in the context of how the GCF works. We have a country-driven approach, which means that we receive the proposals that the countries present through the accredited entities, and of course are aligned with their NDCs and the respective climate change planning documentation. Now, what is important as well in relation to the question is that whenever we receive the proposals coming from the countries and presented to the accredited entities, there is a screening in terms of the GCF investment criteria. And part of this investment criteria is impact potential, precisely. And there is criteria also to make an assessment in terms of how the specific intervention will deliver results for adaptation and mitigation, and also how does that translate in terms of impact on the ground. This also is cross-checked with regards to other criteria such as needs of the recipient and the contribution of the particular intervention to sustainable development. At the end of the day, we have, as GCF, an overall mandate to support countries to move towards a climate resilient and low carbon development. And in that regard, we make an assessment of the funding proposals, but the original proposal comes from the country through an accredited entity. But investment criteria helps in identifying those more impactful.
Thank you. So we are excited as the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance to be working now more closely with the Commonwealth, and particularly the Commonwealth Blue Charter. And we'll be looking to do some work in the South Indian Ocean, which is an area which has barely any investment into, but has a lot of coastal communities that are incredibly dependent on those coastal areas for their livelihoods, their social and economic resilience. We also run an Ocean Risk Innovation Challenge, and through that we have looked at not just investing in some of the bigger NGOs or projects that come to the table, but actually working with, I would even call them smaller than small SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, to help those communities with really good ideas. And we've been working with communities in Tanzania, Indonesia, in the Philippines, and India to surface some of those products so that we can get investment into them. So we're very excited to be working with the Commonwealth on some of those and to be building those with them. And it's great that you've now got a blue finance person in Mauritius, I understand, who will be working to help build the capacity of some of the Commonwealth members as they try and develop and invest, and hopefully with some of the programs that AFD and others are supporting, that gives them a better chance of securing that investment into those projects.
Thank you very much for the insights. My name is Mavis and I work with climate analytics. And we do work with government, and one of the things that we have learned, especially with developing countries, is that it's very difficult to access finance. Lots of bureaucracy and a lot of time, and also the process of assessing the finance is usually really difficult. So I want to ask all of you how you are addressing this challenge of access to finance, specifically for developing countries.
I can take that. I think we're still facing that challenge in Latin America and the Caribbean broadly. One way that we're trying to facilitate it is through greater investment through financial intermediaries. And I think this goes to the cultural shift that someone mentioned about the need to also, I think it was our private sector representative, the need to invest in clients so that they change along with the rest of us. So a lot of the financing that we're directing through climate finance, yes, it is based on projects, but we're still, the Amazon initiative is in our effort to actually push countries to develop their own pipelines of projects, but also through financial intermediaries that are very focused on increasing their green finance and their climate finance targets. Even those that aren't, we're helping them become more aggressive. And obviously climate is one of several issues. I also throw in gender, where we're trying to rely a lot right now just to get the money out the door and dispersed and financed to work with the small and medium-sized enterprises and to address these issues. So that's the fastest way that we're doing it. Obviously, more directly is when we build up our pipeline through the Amazon initiative. We hope that eventually, both on the private and public sector side, there'll be more of a focus on developing climate-specific projects that would facilitate at least our own financing and bringing in private sector actors where relevant.
Does anyone else want to complete? Mathilde, yes, you.
Yeah, I can add up. I mean, of course, and I think Karen, it's you who acknowledge the fact that, especially for biodiversity projects, we're talking about what we call in our world small projects around 5 million euros. It's still a big money, but it's true that for development finance institutions like us, it's difficult to work on this size of project. So intermediation is certainly an option. This is, in a way, also what we are trying to achieve with working with other banks, local banks, especially through the International Development Finance Club, trying to raise concern, to raise attention on biodiversity and to build tools. We're doing it for both climate and biodiversity. All the tools, the tracking that we are implementing, we are also working with those banks so that they can implement it, and they have the capacity to work locally with local money also, which currencies, or with local currency, which is an important aspect of the financing, and build up a portfolio locally, and I think it's important. We have also options. The Kiwa initiative is working with call for projects, for instance. In this type of work, you can build a pipeline of smaller projects, and it's always very important and useful.
Just to know that in the GCF, we also provide support in different stages of the project development cycle, not only when the project has been submitted, but also from the planning and design of and the development of the project proposal. We have the project preparation facility that provides resources as well for the AEs, the accredited entities, and the NDAs to put together funding proposals. We also have the readiness program that contains also a program for the provision of resources for capacity building and project development. And once the project has been submitted, we also liaise with the accredited entity, trying to make that process as straightforward as possible. We understand as well that there is a lot to do on our side to further streamline the processes. And in that context, the board is considering a simplified approval process that is intended to be considered by the board the following year. So hopefully we can simplify the documentation, but also the review procedures and the approval of funding proposals for smaller projects.
Yes.
So just to say, this is where this collaboration is really important, because the projects we support are much smaller than the $5 million range. And we work really closely with the Global Resilience Partnership. And basically what we've done is, through a little bit of funding from the UK and the Government of Canada, we've been able to provide the seed funding and help with the technical capacity building of those projects. And then we hold solution sessions where we bring people around the table to see who might invest in them to build them further. So it's often more challenging for the multilateral banks or some of the bigger banks to do that kind of investment. But that's where the nonprofit sector can come in and help with some of that. So hopefully we can, make sure we check all the different boxes along the way.
Yes, thanks. That's also good to precise that. And I don't know if Sonia wants to add something, because you will have all the type of financial institution explaining you what they can do for your countries. Sonia, are you with us?
I am, yes. We have emerging market specific funds, so our projects would be more, the investments would be more about investing in companies in emerging markets and those providing solutions to some of the issues that we've just discussed. But I think, we need to stay conscious of some of the greatest impacts, both in terms of climate and biodiversity loss, are in developing countries and some of the most exposed sort of emerging economies. And we need to account for that in our investments. And then also, just to pick up on the point that Adil mentioned earlier, with the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation now an observer to the Convention on Biological Diversity, we really hope that the financial sector can be included in that framework, so that we can work towards implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework in the same way that we are doing for the Paris Agreement.
We all hope that. Thanks, Sonia. We have a last question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is just short. I'm Gibson from Papua New Guinea, and And my question is in relation to the GCF funding. I heard that there's part of the biodiversity projects or resilient projects that requires equity from the agencies or from the government. So what kind of projects are you looking at the government for small developing state like us, trying to put up equity to have access to funding to fund the projects again? So I just want to know.
Thank you very much for this question. And I'm very happy also to clarify with regards to the use of financial instruments. The GCF offers a wide range of financial instruments, including loans, that could be also grants, reimbursable grants, equity and guarantees. But that is up to the NDA, the National Designated Authority, in collaboration with the accredited entity presenting the project, to develop the financial structure of the project. Most of the funding that we provide is in the form of grants, but we're also trying to focus whenever possible and whenever it makes sense for the project as well, to provide other types of financial instruments to diversify the portfolio that we have at present, and also to be able to have more flexibility on how we use the different types of instruments. Said that, most of the funds provided by the GCF are grants, and it is up to the national designated authority at the country level, together with the accredited entity, to identify the convenient financial structure. hope that clarifies, but very happy also to discuss separately.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much. I understand there are lots going on, particularly as Jessica.
Can you present you, please?
Sorry. My name is Abdullah. I'm from Pakistan. And Jessica was mentioning a lot of projects are going on. Huge funding is going on. And as you were mentioning, projects in Indonesia, India, and all of that. My simple question is, like, it seems a bit open-ended. Are there, like, any measurable goals? Because there's a huge investment going on. So how are we trying to measure the outcome of these goals? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. That's exactly the problem. And the way that we're going about doing this through the Amazon initiative is we're developing a loans based on results framework that will hopefully become the wave of the future for us at the IDB in terms of how we're providing financing. And it's specifically because of that, because all of us are working off 30% floors for climate finance in general, meeting SDG goals by 2030. But for me in particular, when I came into the institution, my first question was, but how do you measure this and what do you see on the ground? So we're doing that by effectively developing, tailoring KPIs, so indicators and results linked to the financing that we will be providing to governments, and working with donors to ensure that it's all linked up so we can measure the actual results for all of this financing.
Thank you. I think it's also, it's also a question of transparency, of monitoring, and for AFD, it's absolutely critical. And for instance, I referred to earlier in my speech to all the tracking on finance, on nature-positive finance that we are going to implement. Behind tracking is making sure that the funding that we count, that we account for, is really one which has impact on the ground and making sure to avoid absolutely greenwashing. So it's very important that all our institutions manage to implement this kind of tracking. The more common principle it becomes, the better we are, and we're going to be working with those banks towards this.
Thank you. And I think it's also the topic of the TNFT to be able to measure, to assess, to help financial institutions, private ones, but also public ones, with a specific up for public finance, to in some months and finally in 2 years to be able to develop a framework aiming to assess and measure and monitor and disclose above all nature-related risk and opportunities also. So it's in development now. So I think, except if there is a last question, no. You, yes, please. And that will be the last question, sorry, but we have to conclude.
Oops, another one. Oh, we're going to repeat.
It's my lucky day. Thank you very much. I just wanted to see if any of you had a reaction to the whole policy coherence agenda and talk earlier in the discussion, because I think working with many of these countries, that's a very, very critical element, and would love to hear your responses to that.
I have the mic, I can take that first. No, of course, policy coherence is, it's indeed very important. I really like the image, the hole in the buckets that was referred to earlier. Policy coherence is something which starts at various, of course, it's what the governments decide and what the framework they are putting in place in terms of public policies, regulations, and so on. It's also on our side to work on this, being consistent, being coherent. And we have a number of tools that we still need to develop, that we are using for climate, that we need to build for climate and biodiversity. We need to do our assessment, and it's back to your first question. When we start working on a country, we need to have an assessment on both climate and biodiversity. We need to work with them and to support the implementation of long-term strategies, both consistent with the Paris Agreement and with the framework on biodiversity. And And this is what should build the consistency over time. And it's very important for us.
I will just say from our experience working with our countries in our region, yes, we have to be complementary to whatever any government is designing, but I think in many cases, they say they know what they want, but they still need that technical input from us. And I think that's where the confusion starts, because we assume they're giving us the roadmap, and they may give us the contours of a roadmap, and we try to fill in the blanks in a very diffuse way. And I think if we go in, and I'm a big promoter of this, and my team will say it, if we go in with the menu and suite of options of what are our most powerful tools and tailor make that to the needs of the countries, that's a far better, you get a far better outcome than if you go in haphazard and not really organized. And so that's why we, at least at our bank, we've decided to build out that coherent menu of options so that countries at least know these are the topics we're looking at, this is how we're looking at integrating them, and this is how we recommend you try to do that if that's what indeed you want to do. And I think countries have actually been very receptive to that, because they didn't want to say it before, and now they're open to saying, well, we do need the guidance. This isn't a complete roadmap, and now you're here, and we're both admitting it, and everything's on the table. So that's actually in the recent conversations that our teams have had with a lot of our member states. There's been a receptivity to it, and I think that's why we're gaining more traction.
Thanks a lot. So now I have to close this panel. Ladies, I thank you a lot. That was really a rich panel, really, really, really interesting. That shows us that there is a lot to do. And we know that there are a lot of calls for the financial sector, public and above all perhaps private sector, to act on climate, to really do what they commit to do, and to begin or continue to do on biodiversity. But when I hear you, there are so really interesting things now being developed that it gives some hope. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to the audience also for the questions. And now the last word will be to a man, which is that's in our panel, that's rare, not elsewhere. So Mr. Daniele Moretti, please, can you come? I will thank you, ladies, and Daniele will come. So if I don't mistake, and if it's the case, I will ask you to apologize me. You are Director of Implementation at the UNFCCC. You are our host with UK and Scotland, developing this huge and so impressive COP26, and we at COP15 are very, very jealous, I have to say that. So thanks a lot to be here and to provide your concluding points. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, and apologies that I came only at the very end, so I don't have the full picture of the discussion, but the part I heard was really centered on all the key climate finance topics we are dealing with, which is, of course, extended to the other conventions. So I wanted to add my voice to the other conventions, so adding climate convention to friends and colleagues for desertification and biodiversity, and in particular relating to alignment of the financial flows to the goals, in our case of the Paris Agreement, is at this point a reality that is picking up really quite fast in the work of MDBs, in the work of other institutions. Also in response of the demand that are coming from the private sector. So that we have this meeting moment in which luckily there is the sense of long-term and alignment. So the big question is really how to de-risk the investments in these areas, in all the areas that we are dealing with in our three conventions. And it's not easy. On the climate side, climate adaptation is unfortunately the area of work which received the less of the funding. It's much easier and more profitable to invest in mitigation projects and activities. This is a fact, and the industry is fully behind that. So how to fill this gap, because we are listening about the need at least to reach the 50-50 of funding for the mitigation adaptation, which is an important goal, but we are still far from that. And so probably we should look more in the short term as smarter use of grant financing was mentioned here, how filling the gap that is there by having grant finance really fully dedicated to the type of activities that are not funded from public funding and help the private sector also to enter, because they are not really keen in entering an adaptation project or being biodiversity or desertification related. So there is a movement, but we need to expand the scale and the space, and hopefully also out of COP26 there will be some signal in this direction, more visibly and more strong, particularly also from bilateral funding from major donors. So. Of course, we can talk a lot on other key ideas that are existing there, and the best use of this funding. But one last word I wanted to say is relating to the implementation of the 3 conventions at the national level, which in many countries they are dealt in different ministries and is posing additional challenges in a very challenging environment already. So we are, on our side in limited resources, working with the other convention in try to help bridging this at the national level, but we are not, we are not having presence on the ground, and perhaps a lot can be done with working more closely with the finance minister, who can help at the national level of coordinate the efforts, and we have seen already some good results in the climate change process by doing that. So yeah, but I had only 2 minutes, so I took already I took too much. But last word, thanks for coming. It's this joint effort from the 3 conventions. There will be more events, including later today high-level discussion. And thanks for the hospitality here in the pavilion, the GEF-GCF Pavilion. Yeah, let's see how this COP26 will be, and thanks for the contribution of all. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And thank you to all. Bye.